Now, to say thanks very much to Alison for spending an hour and a half the other day working how to actually show the slides and also be on broadcasting to the rest of the audience online. At least I hope that that's what we're doing. Okay, so welcome to the first thinking space for this semester. Today, well, I'd like to welcome everyone here. I want to say that this is being recorded for hopefully be put on YouTube, which is what we've been doing in the past, so be careful what you say in the background. And before we start, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We are currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so look, I will get on with it. Today's presentation is by John Connell. He's talking about Kiribati, which I think sort of kind of been in the news lately. So, John, would you like to start?
Thanks, Bob. I'm afraid I'm a bit of a guinea pig with this technology, so I can only hope it works. And indeed, the technology of the lectern as well is a bit problematic, so I hope everything doesn't fall over in any sense. Thank you all for coming on a day of Kiribati-like temperatures. Bear with me if I'm slightly self-indulgent at the moment, but I was reflecting last week that almost 50 years ago, as an innocent young student at London University, I thought, I should have a job when I leave this place. It might be a good idea. And I applied to the Foreign Office, and they offered me a position of being a cadet officer in the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony. I thought, that was kind of interesting. I didn't know much about the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony. Some people called it the Gilbert and Sullivans, which wasn't terribly exciting. But I was also, had been very much a stamp collector, as people were in those days. And it seemed like a nice ordered place. And I think there's a big story here about stamps and empire and how the place sort of colonizes places, the wildlife and animals at the top, and the economy at the bottom. It seemed like it was progressive, but I didn't think they'd have a football team, so I decided I probably wouldn't go. What I did do, relatedly, is look at perhaps the most famous book that's ever been written on the Pacific, or the Gilbert Islands, called A Pattern of Islands, by a guy who was an early cadet officer in the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony in 1913. And like most books of its time, 1952, it said, I quote from the Times, a work of art, the book is full of humanity, the laughter of natives and their friendliness to the white man. It's always gendered in those days. But to the readers of another generation, it will perhaps be most remarkable as a record of the kindliness of an empire. Well, you can probably and of course, it has the obligatory Dusky Maiden on the back cover. There's a whole genre of books of that era that do the same thing. So, okay, I eventually got to Kiribati in 1980 for the first time. I'll talk about that in a moment. So I want to start with something I've started with from before. Paul Gauguin's famous painting from 1897, usually entitled something like, Where do we come from? Who are we? And where are we going? So thinking about mobility, thinking about migration, reflecting on the future here in the Marquesas Islands, but an enigmatic fallen paradise and so on. Actually, if you look in Wikipedia, they're not supposed to do that, but there's quite a nice description of this island, this photograph. Painting. So I'm looking at mobility and its intersections with other things, how we and they and others belong, what this means in terms of citizenship, what it means in terms of emotion, how we think about desire, disappointment, frustration, nostalgia, how all those things are built in to mobility and migration. So, where is Kiribati? Well, there it is. We can, as you can see, and if you compare it with Australia, it takes up quite a lot of space of the South Pacific. So you can look at it, as many people do, as very much a small island state, 33 coral atolls, tiny little places, or you can think about it as a big ocean state, as people increasingly do. So here's this duality appearing. There are three groups of islands, essentially. The Gilbert Islands, where the name Kiribati comes from. If you say the Gilberts, often enough, the kit comes out as Kiribati eventually. The Phoenix Islands, which are here, so the lagoon here, and the Line Islands to the east. But most people live on the Gilbert Islands chain in the west. Okay, so what I thought I might do is put in a few little pictures to get a sense of what Kiribati sort of looks like. All, unfortunately, come from Tarawa, the capital, which is not reflective of outer islands, but nonetheless, here we go. The familiar narrow strip of land, ocean on one side, lagoon on the other. The challenges of actually growing anything in these kinds of environment, very difficult. Many of the islands are very much drought-ridden, particularly in the southern Gilberts. And life, of course, is pretty tough when you're gardening, so you've got to take a rest now and again. Fishing, of course, plays a large part in people's lives, as you would expect. I don't know what I said to this girl, it must have been extremely rude, but there we are. So fish becomes a small-scale commodity, sold to households by fishers on the main island. Again, we're talking Tara. People somewhat illegally take turtles as well. And there are also little stalls where you can buy this, that, and the other, a bit of agricultural produce, some fish, as you saw, toddy that's being made, coconuts, and bigger stores like this, selling the products of imports, rice, tin fish, ironically, and so on. And sometimes selling rather strange commodities which were mistranslated in the transition to Kiribati. Big issue is water supplies. Where do people get water from? Mostly from rainfall and not reticulated systems. But the backup supply, if you like, is getting down into the lens on the atoll. Water can be brackish, salty, not very good, but useful for washing clothes at least. Okay, so this is probably one of the most photographed signs on the island. Highest point on South Tara, 3 meters above sea level. So a reminder, coral atolls, not very high above sea level. Save these islands, yes we can. Okay, this is, well, on one occasion of flooding. And it's a picture that's been used by a couple of people. Anote Tom, the former president of Kiribati, and Akarimon, who was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of Kiribati, to illustrate an article called "The Seas Are Coming for Us in Kiribati, Will Australia Rehome Us?" So there's a particular perspective here that, as we'll see a bit later on, that as they say in that article, our land is disappearing faster and global action can stem climate change. That's a very controversial statement, but it is, if you like, what's been called one of many Pacific extinction narratives. We're all disappearing. It's going to go, who's going to help us out, and so on. I'll come back onto that much later, because it links up to something I talk about, migration to dignity, and of course, to climate justice. Okay, there's a fun side of Kiribati as well when you're not growing things. There's the dance party on a Friday night for $2. Okay, a short background history in some ways. First people in Kiribati got there probably around 2000 before the present. Thanks, Stephen, for that update on that. But livelihoods were always uneasy. Never easy on coral atolls at the best of times, and the best of times was sometimes not there at all. Drought was a familiar problem, probably the greatest hazard throughout the Gilbert Islands at any particular time. So here's a nice quotation from a missionary from 1860 saying, "So prolific are they on the greater number of islands, so uncontaminated by foreign disease, that their population deliberately limited by practicing abortion. The numbers are shown by the sanguinary nature of their battles." Come back onto that later. The sanguinary nature of their battles. 4 or 5 children were considered enough, and any above that number are not allowed to come to the maturity, not down to the bottom. After all, virtually all small islands in the Pacific, it's been practiced for time immemorial, when the population threatened to overstep the resources of the islands, the surplus inhabitants set sail in search of new lands. So this is almost a classic Malthusian perspective from 150 years ago, saying that there's always this pressure on resources. People must adapt by, in this case, he's arguing, by mobility. Okay, so hazards were common in the pre-colonial era, particularly droughts, particularly in the southern group. Probably cyclones were there occasionally, but some of Kiribati is on the equator, so cyclones are less likely to be particularly problematic. People often live their lives on atolls in what's been called coral clusters. They linked up with other atolls for support, for mobility, exchanging resources when those things became short. So migration, local migration, was a form of adaptation by taking up land, sending off children, metaphorically children who were adopted off island in the past, served as ropes, binding together families stretched over vast stretches of ocean. So children would be adopted and move around to give you a little toehold, foothold, whatever, in a distant atoll, part of your coral cluster. So if your atoll was stretched, or part of the atoll was stretched, then there was possible survival elsewhere. So that's the positive side. On the other side, there's also, again, a downside. But warfare was not unusual. Kiribati Gilbertese were known for being fairly warlike. There's a picture of somebody recreating armor and weapons from earlier days. So it asks questions about how good was these linkages, the Gulf, of course, a sea of islands, but I won't get into that for the moment. So, much later, the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony was founded in 1892, one of the last British possessions. As it's the main historian of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands says, in fact, the book is entitled The Cinderellas of Empire. Nobody really wanted the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. They didn't seem at all profitable. Why on earth would you want to take over those places? Eventually, nearly a century later, Kiribati became independent, preceded by Tuvalu the year before. So the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, the Gilbert Islands became Kiribati, a Micronesian state. The Ellice Islands became Tuvalu, a Polynesian state. So separation in search of identity. Okay, so moving backwards and forwards. Sorry, I can't avoid doing this. Drought, particularly, was problematic in the 1930s. People were settled from the southern Gilbert Islands to the Phoenix Islands, a little group in the middle, in the 1930s. But then later on, during the war and after the war, there was drought in the Phoenix Islands. So people pleaded with the colonial government to be relocated from the Phoenix Islands. And eventually they were. There was some feeling that some of those people who relocated to the Phoenix Islands have been putting salt in their wells, just to show how bad the water supply was, how impoverished it all was. So again, this sort of notion that there's a physical change, but also don't really like this isolation, this loneliness, this inability to develop an effective livelihood on what were fairly dry islands. Anyway, whatever. They were resettled again from the Solomon Islands to the Solomon Islands again during the colonial era, when these things could be done. The British government could move people from Fiji or into Fiji, or from Kiribati into the Gilbert Islands into the Solomon Islands. And here's two Gilbertese of Kiribati talking about this much later. In earlier days, these people were forced out to the Solomon Islands. They were the land-hungry people, the unfortunate ones who didn't have sufficient land. Now our values have changed. Suddenly overseas, beyond the ocean of our islands, something to be sought after. Why? Because our population is still growing. Those who are resettled will not suffer the same problems that we will suffer. So now many consider them, the resettled ones, as the fortunate ones. They consider us to be the unfortunate ones. So rethinking how we think about Gilbertese, think about migration, mobility, and so on. Hopping back again. For going back about 200 years, people started getting jobs from the Gilbert Islands, getting jobs on whaling ships, then rather later, in the 19th century, being blackbirded, taken away to work on plantations, a handful in Australia, but more went eastwards to Fiji and Samoa and to other places. So diversity of mobility is beginning to appear. In the last century, for the whole of the last century, people became mine workers on Nauru, adjacent Nauru, digging phosphate and so on. That lasted for the whole of the 20th century, a major source of income for the people of the Gilberts. In the middle of the 20th century, seafaring began to become another means of going away, earning money, and coming back. So for the first time, essentially, people were now being trained for migration. Kiribati and later on, Tuvalu set up marine training schools to train people with the skills required to be seafarers so they could get good jobs on German shipping lines and so on, and with that, stay there and send money back. So here's the process that by the nation is called going away without leaving in order to stay. So you're going away, but you're always thinking about home, and you were leaving because you could generate enough income to come back and survive in these relatively poor islands. Okay, so there are all kinds of, if you like, binaries, dichotomies, whatever you want to call them. Migration gradually became more normative, it became expected of people, what you would do, even a sort of rite of passage to adulthood. And so in some places, it's evolved into what some people have called the transnational corporation of kin, the way in which households actually identify particular people. You'll go to that place. You, less educated, you better go there. But we spread our human resources. And I kind of, I'm now hopping to Tonga, which is totally illegal for this talk, but here we are. When you go to Tonga, as you do, you wander through graveyards and look at the graves. What else is there to do in Tonga? And this is a grave of this elderly lady. And this is she's saying, here's where all my children are, and thank them for coming well, she couldn't thank them, but who've put together this gravestone and so on and so forth. So here's her family. One in Spokane, these are 8 children. One in Spokane in USA, one in Tonga, one in Perth, Australia, one in Sydney, one in Auckland, another one in a different part of Tonga, one in Dallas, another one in Tonga. So here's the classic structure of people moving out into different places for different kinds of reasons, and it is sort of like, some people would say, this transnational structure. Not yet particularly valid in Kiribati because permanent migration by sea is not yet particularly significant. So, so in modern times, seafaring and mining have been something prototypes of migration. Increasingly, you have to have skills to do it, sending back remittances, changing values, and so on and so forth. And there are various elements of that have become significant. Kai was the Kiribati Australian Nursing Initiative, which was a disaster, but it was to send nurses overseas and they would get extra skills and go back. Or better still, unfortunately, stay in Australia and send remittances back. And then there was, Australia came up with, about 5 years ago, it's a so-called microstate visa. For countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu, Nauru, which had no colonial history in the region and therefore had no easy entree into places like New Zealand and Australia, to come up with a microstate visa, especially for those relatively impoverished states, the so-called orphan states. Then in more, again, similar times, we see the rise of the regional system employment scheme in New Zealand, our seasonal worker program, which has evolved into PALM, Pacific Australia Labour Migration Scheme. So a whole flow of guest workers coming into agriculture and increasingly now into some other activities like working in abattoirs, not so skilled, but possibly becoming more skilled in the future. Part of the idea was that people would gain agricultural and other skills in Australia, take those skills back home and use them to benefit themselves or the states that they came from. I was always fascinated by the fact that there's one Gilbertese woman somewhere out in Western Queensland whose main job is skinning kangaroos, which I'm not sure is going to be a terribly useful skill to take back to Kiribati. So, again, multiple modes of migration, different durations, different places, different times, in which economics seems to have been relatively increasingly triumphant. However, despite this economic rationale, there's important cultural underpinnings. Remittances are really about, in many ways, empathy, love particularly. This is a quote from nearby island in Tuvalu, actually. Sorry, I'm just going around it, but that's the only way to do it. We don't have enough decent quotes from Kiribati. So the primary means to which economic reciprocity and gift giving are socially controlled. An economy of effect to such categories as power, prestige, knowledge, and other symbolic commodities. Remittances become not just an economic activity, but an emotional obligation. So you have what is described in parts of PNG as a sing-out economy. People sing out to send remittances back. And there's a reciprocity in that. We did a little project in Vanuatu about that, which was kind of fun, about different flows of food in different directions to stimulate the flow of remittances. So the people back home don't have much to exchange, but what they do have is food. In fact, my favourite article, I think, of all time is one about Ecuadorian migrants to New York, which was entitled, "It Doesn't Taste as Good from the Pet Shop. Guinea pig consumption, the performance of transnational class relations." So there you go. People are sending back cooked guinea pigs because they taste better. But that's a primer for the larger flows, the economic flows in the opposite direction. I should say at this point, when we think about the economy of Kiribati, it's often described as a mirror economy to do with migration, remittances, aid with a bureaucratic endpoint. So migration is central, very much central to what happens in Kiribati. I should also say that fishing is fishing in the sense of fishing by deep water fishing nations is probably much more important than all of these because they've done really well in bargaining collectively with the various deep water fishing states. Okay, so this is stimulated by letters from people. In the old days, these are letters that went from one particular atoll, Nuku'alofa, to people working overseas, crying, hoping, longing, regretting. Behave well and do not forget us. This is a big message also that goes out to the guest workers in the Pacific, both from their households, behave well and do not forget us, but also from the government. Behave well. Otherwise, we Samoans may not be able to go again. We Tongans might not be able to go. Behave well. You've got to do the right thing. So there's a lot of rhetoric about how it all works and an enforced attachment to home. A discourse of nostalgia that talks about the warm, clean air of the atolls, the foods you remember, the bounteous seas, the fragrant flowers. So that as one Kiribati migrant says, the outer island is like Blue Lagoon Island. No need to pay. You have fish and breadfruit. There's no need to pay. You don't need to plant. And you can get water from the well. There's firewood, so no need to pay for electricity. It's a lovely nostalgic view of something which islands are not actually quite like in many ways. Nostalgia becomes very selective, but it is very much about family ties, and family ties and kinship are written on the ground. At the same time, people who go away for rather longer often send children back. It's a classic thing in Australia for Tongans to send children back to Tonga to learn the right way, to do the right thing, to learn proper culture and language and so on. So the islands become the locus of moral authority. Mock Hills Island, just to the north of Kiribati, beckons beyond the eastern horizon. Time patiently awaits their return, promising a life less financially burdened, a life less filled with the stress of paying bills, putting food on the table. People in Papua New Guinea always used to tell me, it's really awful in town, you know. We go to town, we even have to pay to go to the toilets. I don't know why that became such a significant problem, but it was always about the village was the superior, morally superior place. So you can think of the villages that people might go back to. Here's a nice idyllic picture of Kiribati, there's the blue seas, the coconut palms, the fragrant flowers, and so on and so forth. But you can also see around the corner in islands that are atolls that are only 2 meters high. There's a 10-meter high, 10-meter high garbage dump, the highest point on this particular island. What do you do? What do you do with the car parks? What do you do with the batteries? What do you do with other kinds of refuse when you really don't have anything approximating to a circular economy? It is not always quite so idyllic. Okay, there's one thing I haven't talked about, and that's sort of the elephant in the atoll, climate change. And this is my big moment of infamy. This is a local regional magazine, a bit like Newsweek or Time magazine, Pacific Islands Monthly, from April, May 1989. So, at a time when people were just beginning to think about these issues, this thing called climate change, greenhouse effect, I've heard about it, but what does it mean for us? So with my then colleague Peter Roy, who's a geologist here, we wrote a little article, it was put in Pacific Islands Monthly, and to us it was a very sober statement. People talk, scientists mentioning this possibility that things are happening, world is warming, possibly sea level rise. So what do they put on the cover? The greenhouse effect. Say goodbye to Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and the Great Barrier Reef. Next edition of the magazine. How dare these people write us off in this kind of way? We're not drowning, we're not sinking, it's not like that at all. John Connell should not come to our island. Nobody's going to invest in Kiribati when this is the message they're going to get. So I lay low for at least a week or so. So the outcome of obviously these kinds of things is that we have particularly various the notion that atolls particularly are threatened because they're only 2 meters above sea level, and some of them then become so-called poster children of the extinction crisis, where particularly through our Kiribati, of course the Kachin Islands, a little more atoll off the coast of Labrador. So we get seen very much as very vulnerable. Seen as vulnerable by different groups of people, NGOs, an issue for NGOs to take up, academics, nice stories about exciting stuff, other kinds of agencies, and above all, the media. In something like a decade, 14 camera crews went to Kachin Islands to record the disappearance of those islands. Tuvalu, likewise, Kiribati, the same thing. The other side of the story is we're resilient. We can do these things, we can change. We're not going to go under. But nobody much was talking about that because vulnerability paid off in some kinds of ways. Here's a quotation from a statement from a Marshall Islands leader on this side of the island. We're adapters. We've adapted to the harshest living conditions since the creation of time. I'm sure we will survive the climate change. But those voices, in some ways, are being drowned out. The voices of the vulnerable. And so we have what, extending from that, what Sophie is called, a very nice article, performative vulnerability. So here's my picture of performative vulnerability. This is the Foreign Minister of Tuvalu, Simon Crawford, just before COP26 in 2021, demonstrating here we are sinking beneath the waves, got to do something about it. Classic example, I think, of this. We are extremely vulnerable, things have to change. Okay, so are the atolls vulnerable? Well, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So we do this in physical terms. Are they eroding? Are they disappearing? Are they going under? Well, even in the Western Pacific, where sea level rise is higher than in most other places, there's no particular evidence that the size, planform, if you like, of these islands is disappearing. So I generally take the view of, I think, Tommy and others in this department, Paul Kench, Russell and others, that size is generally of atolls is not declining. Certainly true even of the Carterets and Taku, which is joining out as far as we know. What is happening is obviously hazards are happening, more intense hazards. Not sure that drought is more intense, maybe it is. It's certainly been going for a couple of years, the last 2 years in the southern Gilbert Islands. There are wind waves, cyclones. Cyclone Pam, which wiped out Vanuatu a couple of years ago, 1,000 kilometres away from Kiribati, also very much damaged those islands. So there are all kinds of stresses. There's coral bleaching, which is certainly happening. There's ocean acidification. But the physical shape of the atolls is not particularly changing. What else? What has happened to livelihoods? Well, people are saying, very obviously, that every time a flood washes over, cyclones blow waves across the island, then agriculture is flooded. We can't restore that for at least a year. Our water supplies are gone because they're contaminated. How can we survive in those kinds of circumstances? Equally important, and probably more important, is the migration of fish. Fishing moving around and not necessarily there as they were before. So the whole basis of the economy, agriculture and fishing, is at risk, very much so, from climate change. But there's one other thing which most people don't talk about, and that it's not a physical thing or basic livelihoods, but it's something else. And that's the fact that there is in most atolls a revolution in rising expectations. People expect more. They expect a different kind of life. The first time I went in 1980, I was wandering around and talking to this young man. I said, why did you come to the capital city? Why did you come to Tara? Why did you leave your home outer island? He said, you know, on our island we've heard about these things called cars, but I've never seen a car. I wanted to come and see what a car looks like. It may not be a general reason for migration, but it's part of a becoming modern, becoming involved in the wider world, and seeing much more of that, much more of the time, and why people leave some of their outer islands, not because of these physical changes, only partly so, but because they now have different kinds of expectations of what life might bring or where they might be. So there are all kinds of debates there about should we go or should we stay? Some people put children back. This is atolls again, talking about atolls to the north. You put our children back to some of these islands. Or is, again, thinking back 200 years, another version of the adoption basis, and he actually calls it homeland security. We put these kids back on our atolls, they'll be there, and we can go back where they are. So kin become a sort of anchor population, the group that stay at home, so you can go back however long maybe you've been away. So there are emotional underpinnings based around the uncertainties of migration, the duty of migration, and so on. So climate change sharpens, maybe, the mobility focus, but doesn't really change all that much. Again, it's the same old duality to go or to stay. To remain on an island like Mock, as some people say, until the last soil is washed away, we will stay there. So there's rhetoric, maybe resilience, maybe migration is a failure because you've had to leave and you didn't want to, or maybe it's that migration is adaptation. It's where the better life is, where you see cars, maybe one day you might even own a car. I'm going to skip on. And there's one other thing as well, and that is when people talk about going, what are they leaving behind? They're leaving behind much of their culture in some ways, if you believe that the culture is on the ground as well, and that you can't always take it with you. But what is also under the ground is your ancestors. People always talk about, we cannot leave. This is where our land is, this is where our ancestral land is. This is where our ancestors are buried. If you wander through the section of Marshall Islands, this picture, my pictures of Kiribati graves are not all that good. Some fetish like graves, obviously wandering through graveyards in Tonga as well. But almost every backyard has a relative buried in the yard. They are very close at hand. They are part of that kinship, not just being written on the ground, but pretty well buried underneath the ground. And here's somebody talking from a smaller island, just to the north of Kiribati. Sonsorol. It's not nice to think about nobody living there. The world cannot adapt to us, we adapt to it. It's going to be sad to see that nobody's going to live in Sonsorol. It's where you can say, I'm from that place. Nobody lives there. What's the point of saying that? Sonsorol has a population of about 30. So you can see this population falling. How can you be viable once you get to a certain point? Okay, so what is happening generally is, I would argue, months ago in the conversation, that the margins of the Pacific are gradually fading. On a national scale, people are leaving the outer islands of Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and so on. Each of these three states, at least 50% of the population living in the areas. They've moved out of the small of the atolls on the periphery. The whole of the Pacific, other than these urban atolls where people move into, every single coral island atoll is losing population. Every single one. Whether it's in French Polynesia, whether it's in Tuvalu, whether it's in Tokelau, whether it's in the Federated States of Micronesia, or wherever. At an international level, some countries are now losing populations in their entirety. Following the model of Niue and the Cook Islands, Tuvalu now has a declining population. Marshall Islands has a rapidly declining population as people move out to the United States. Kiribati, not yet. It's still a bit of an orphan, but it's highly likely that will happen before too long. So, this is getting back to Simon Coffey again. He's been thinking about this one, and they decided in Tuvalu that they should have a presence in the metaverse. Tuvalu, he says, Tuvalu will replicate itself into the metaverse. Our land, our ocean, our culture, the most precious assets of our people, to keep them safe and harm. No matter what happens in the physical world, we will move them to the cloud. Not exactly sure how that will work, but it is part of this, what I call fading margins. So here's, again, we go back where we are. Carteret Islands, by the way, here. Kiribati, part of Micronesia. Marshall Islands losing population. The Tuvalu losing population. Tokelau, it's the same. Cook Islands losing population. Here's the Marquesas that Logan was talking about. They too are losing population out of it. So all Micronesia, Polynesia, significantly losing population in many parts of the region. Melanesia, by and large, unchanged. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. So, thinking about, how much time have I got? 5 minutes? Okay, thinking about people overseas, as people have now left places like Kiribati and Tuvalu, the biggest changes for them, as they France, and mobile phones, and Facebook and so on, and the ability to keep in touch with home pretty well on a daily basis. So what some used to call daily transnationalism. You can be permanently in contact with your relatives back home in Kiribati through these media. So technology keeps memories and emotions vivid and enforced. Nostalgia becomes part of technological life. So curiously, phones and Facebook become an enhanced agency for cultural retention. And part of that, and I think it's logical and it's kind of what you'd expect, is that in many atolls where people have left, like Namibia, Kapinga-Rangi, and so on, there's a greater fascination in genealogies. Again, back to Goga. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And genealogy is shaped by this modern technology. Okay. So, almost to the end. As Julian Boras, the Australian writer, said, once you're a migrant, you never know where home is ever again. Always here, or there, or somewhere else. Emotions are shaped by memories, imaginations, expectations, and aspirations. Political economies are inseparable from and are dominated by emotion. So, a necessarily flexible conclusion, 200 plus years of mobility and migration towards what future? Future somewhere else, beyond Kiribati for some, or what? But constant outwards orientation, but constant thinking about where we have come from. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Migration always constrained by economics, by culture, politics, but also by emotion. Abilities embedded in emotion. Nostalgia, longings, kinship, inescapable homes. Emotions, too, are socially constructed and spatially contingent. So that leaves us essentially, with, even at a young age in Kiribati, people gambling with their future. Should they go or should they stay? Or indeed, like me, sometimes sitting on a hammock, looking out to the distance and saying, where are we going? Who are we? Where do we come from? What will my future be? So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, John. I'll just close the screen. Okay, well, I guess we have time for a few questions. So, I think it's a nice piece of anthropology, John.
Well, I did do some anthropology in my degree a long time ago when I was contemplating being a cadet officer.
Okay, some questions. Sophie?
Good question. I guess not totally fully formed, but that never stops me. I'm just wondering about like the kind of responsibilities, the kind of claims about climate change that have a kind of justice element or a political claims making element about responsibility. So it's less about like we are actually drowning and more about, you know, we didn't cause this problem and someone owes us. And I guess, you know, if you think about, you know, based on that article, I'm asked all the time about are these countries actually sinking? And I think that's kind of not the point. Like, without all of that work about Kiribati drowning, no one would know about that country anymore. And now everyone knows that Kiribati exists just based on Anote Tong's work in the last kind of 15 years. So it's, I think, a kind of like political claim around representation, responsibility. I'm just wondering like how that fits into this.
No, that was the little bit on that particular overhead that I didn't actually talk about. And that was the where it says, you know, there's a blame game here, and then there's climate justice. I didn't come back to that, and that's, you're quite right. That was the whole point of saying we are vulnerable, but it is not our fault. We did not cause this. Somebody else caused this historically, and still causing it now, and we deserve justice.
John, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just wondering, because you talked a lot about, you know, people migrating out of the islands, and I'm just wondering, you know, what kind of groups or who come into the island? So do you have this, you know, church, do you have NGOs, do you have development agencies that come in? And I'm just wondering, how are they accommodating to the kind of traditional or indigenous adaptation strategies that the communities have? For sure, even before the talk of climate change, you know, communities have already know how to adapt to their environment. So I'm just wondering, you know, if that's been accommodated.
You reminded me about last time I went to Kiribati about 4 or 5 years ago, and when you got to the immigration, there was a line that said, the Kiribati this way, consultants that way. So a little bit like that. There are not actually a lot of foreign migrants in Kiribati at all. There are a lot of transient consultants, there are a handful of tourists. Kiribati would like to get tourism going, but it is so expensive to get there, and frankly, there's not a lot to see. It cannot be replicated somewhere else.
The tourism they get is kind of competitive tourism. Like I've been to every country in the world, so. But you have to go there for 3 days because there's only 2 flights a week. Which is more than they want to. They just want to go for.
So probably, I'm talking about many circuits, relatively homogeneous population.
Okay.
I think an important point to make is that atoll islands, and people tend to forget this, is they're very dynamic features. They're being constructed and made all the time. Not only that, the interaction of people with that construction is quite clear as well. So that people have actually, in the past, and I assume in the future too, have occupied these islands whilst they're being made up and whilst they've been in probably a fairly horrible state. So they've been subjected to overwashing construction and whilst people have lived on them. So there's a long history, first of all, of that happening, but also people adapting to it as well.
No, you're completely right. That's right. And it also reminds me, thinking about those issues about whether the islands are eroding or not, that almost always all the pictures of erosion come, as the one I showed you from that article here, they come from the most urban built-up areas where people have been manifestly, dramatically changing the landscape. Yes.
And now, as you know, many of the poster children of sea level rise that you see all the time are actually the result of local, and often by the people who are living there, local interference in the environment, and nothing to do with global scale.
No, so that's right. So a lot of it has to do with building seawalls, but a lot of this is building channels.
Yeah, that's right.
Constraining flows in and out of the lagoon. And those have created enormous areas of erosion, but also of deposition, usually somewhere else. But people don't talk about those things. They don't want to see those things. The areas of deposition are not necessarily useful.
Okay, any more questions?
I actually have a question, John, just purely out of interest, but you mentioned fish migration. So at some stage you sort of mentioned that fish were migrating, and that I'm assuming has implications for livelihood and all sorts of other things. Is that actually fish migration, or is it that the populations you're seeing a shift in populations because of changes in sea surface temperature or other things? Or is it actually
I think probably migration is probably not quite the right word to put there. So the changes in fish populations as they respond to the different seawater temperatures. So the various fish that inhabit coral reefs and all that are changing their composition, changing their distribution. Now, as far as I can see from the evidence from some atolls, particularly in Tahiti, where they're not the present composition of fish species is not as valuable as it's been. That's probably not true everywhere. Again, one of the problems here is I've sort of been trying to generalise about 33 coral atolls, the Gilbert Islands, and then to extend that to this sort of marine Milky Way of atolls that go all the way across from Palau to French Polynesia. I'd like to make sweeping generalisations, and I probably have, but they're not entirely justified.
Okay, before we have any more questions from the room, are there any people on Zoom who have questions? I can only see one, but there are other people on Zoom, I think. No? Yeah. Adrian?
Nope.
Okay, no questions. Any more questions?
Thanks, John. What's the kind of government narrative around migration? Are they seeking to encourage inflow, outflow, particular movement within that enormous territory?
I missed that out completely for some reason. I was thinking about something else. As I said, the guy who wrote this article is Note Tom, who was the president of Kiribati for 15 years until 2016. So he was the one who came up with the notion of migration for dignity, that we shouldn't just be peasants going somewhere and scrubbing floors, we should get skilled jobs. The skilled jobs we might have for some people, like the nurses, as part of the idea, to be able to stay in these distant countries and be a sort of beachhead for others to follow. But at least, even if you're going to come back, at least to have the income from a skill job better than nothing. So his big push was to have migration with dignity. He lost power in 2016 and was replaced by Denis Mau. Mau was from the southernmost island, a much more conservative island. He tended to take a biblical view of things, that Noah, because God had promised Noah that the islands would not disappear, then the islands would not disappear. So he was less concerned about particular directions of migration and more concerned about working within Kiribati itself to promote the outer islands, to encourage people to stay on their islands. For example, he subsidised copra so that people would stay there, get a better price and so on, rather than have to migrate. So there are two quite different disjunctures, a disjuncture, in how people were thinking about it. So, I mean, I know Thomas' view is certainly still there, and probably predominates, but it's become downplayed within the country at the moment.
Okay, any more questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you. See you all in a couple of weeks for the next session. Thank you.